The rope swayed gently in the morning breeze, casting shadows across the courthouse steps like a pendulum counting down the final moments of a condemned man's life. Marcus Whitfield stood beneath the gallows, hands bound behind his back, watching. The crowd gathered with the hungry anticipation of those who had come to witness what they believed was justice. His once proud shoulders sagged under the weight of public shame, his gray hair disheveled from a sleepless night in the county jail. The charges were clear: treason against the Union, conspiracy to incite rebellion, and the murder of 3 freedmen, who had dared to claim their rightful wages. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. But in the sea of angry faces, one man pushed through the crowd with quiet determination. Ezekiel Washington moved like water through stone, his weathered hands steady despite the chaos surrounding him. 27 years he had spent in bondage under Marcus Whitfield's roof. 27 years of dawn-to-dusk labor, of watching his own children sold away, of swallowing words that could have gotten him killed. Now in the autumn of 1867, as Reconstruction Georgia struggled between old hatred and new hope, Ezekiel carried something in his coat pocket that could save the very man who had once owned him. The sheriff checked his pocket watch. 10 minutes until the execution. The crowd pressed closer, their voices rising like a storm about to break. And somewhere in that mob, a former slave prepared to risk everything for a man who had never shown him mercy. 3 days before the hanging, Ezekiel Washington sat on the porch of his small cabin, mending a fishing net by the light of a kerosene lamp. The October evening air carried the scent of burning leaves and distant wood smoke, reminders that winter approached whether a man was ready or not. His fingers worked the hemp with practiced precision, each knot tied with the patience of someone who had learned long ago that rushing led to mistakes, and mistakes led to punishment. The cabin stood on a plot of land he had purchased with his own money, earned through backbreaking labor in the sawmill outside Millerville. It wasn't much 4 rooms with a tin roof that leaked when the rains came hard, but it was his. The deed bore his name in careful script, witnessed and recorded at the county courthouse where, just 2 years earlier, he wouldn't have been permitted to enter through the front door. Freedom had come to Ezekiel not with the Emancipation Proclamation, but with General Sherman's march through Georgia in late 1864. He remembered the morning when the blue-coated soldiers had ridden up the long drive to Whitfield Manor, their horses' hooves thundering against the packed earth like drumbeats announcing the end of an era. Marcus Whitfield had stood on his veranda, rifle in hand, knowing that his world was crumbling, but too proud to surrender without some gesture of defiance. Ezekiel had been in the tobacco fields that morning, directing a crew of younger men in the harvest. At 42, he served as something between an overseer and a slave, trusted with responsibilities that set him apart from the others, but never enough to forget his place. When the soldiers came, they found him there among the brown leaves, his hands stained with earth and tobacco juice, his back straight despite decades of labor that had bent lesser men. "You're free now," the young lieutenant had told him, his words carrying the authority of the federal government, but somehow feeling hollow in the Georgia heat. "All of you. Pack what you can carry and come with us, or stay and work for wages. Your choice." Choice. Such a simple word, yet it had felt foreign on Ezekiel's tongue. For 27 years, choices had been made for him: when to rise, when to eat, when to work, when to rest. He had been permitted to marry Sarah, but only after Marcus Whitfield had given his approval. He had been allowed to hold his children, but only until they were old enough to be sold to neighboring plantations, when Whitfield needed money for gambling debts. The other slaves had looked to Ezekiel for guidance that morning, their eyes wide with a mixture of hope and terror. Freedom was a dream they had whispered about in the quarters after dark, but now that it stood before them in blue uniforms and polished buttons, It seemed almost too large to grasp. "We staying or going, Zeke?" Old Thomas had asked, his voice trembling with age and uncertainty. Thomas had been born on Whitfield land, had never known any world beyond the plantation's borders. The thought of leaving terrified him more than staying. Ezekiel had looked toward the manor house, where Marcus Whitfield still stood watching the soldiers with undisguised hatred. Even in defeat, the man carried himself with the arrogance of someone who believed the natural order of things would eventually reassert itself. His jaw was set, his pale blue eyes hard as winter ice, and Ezekiel could read the promise there that this interruption would be temporary, that things would return to the way they had always been. "We go," Ezekiel had said finally, and something in his voice made it clear that this was not a suggestion, but a decision. Pack light, move fast, and don't look back. But leaving had proven easier said than done. The war had devastated Georgia, leaving a landscape of burned towns and broken infrastructure. The roads were clogged with refugees, former slaves seeking family members, Confederate soldiers limping home from surrender, carpetbaggers heading south with dreams of quick profits. Food was scarce, work was scarcer, and freedom often felt like just another word for hunger. Ezekiel had found temporary shelter for his group in a contraband camp outside Atlanta, where thousands of freed slaves struggled to build new lives from nothing. The conditions were harsh, overcrowded tents, inadequate food, disease spreading through the camp like wildfire. Children cried constantly from hunger, and old people who had survived decades of bondage died within weeks of gaining their liberty. It was there that Ezekiel had met Isaiah Walker, a freedman from South Carolina who had taught himself to read using a Bible stolen from his master's library. Isaiah spoke of schools being built for colored children, of political rights that might soon be granted, of a future where the color of a man's skin would not determine the boundaries of his possibilities. "Education," Isaiah had said, his eyes bright with conviction. "That's the key to everything. They can take away your land, they can cheat you out of wages, but they can't take away what you carry in your head." Ezekiel had listened to these words with the hunger of a man who had been denied intellectual nourishment his entire life. He had always possessed a sharp mind. Whitfield had recognized this and used it, giving Ezekiel responsibilities that required planning and decision-making. But formal education had been forbidden, the ability to read and write considered dangerous in the hands of the enslaved. Under Isaiah's patient instruction, Ezekiel had learned his letters, then words, then entire sentences. The process was slow and frustrating, his calloused fingers clumsy with the pen, his mind struggling to connect abstract symbols with familiar sounds. But gradually, the mysterious marks on paper began to reveal their secrets, and with each page he conquered, Ezekiel felt a door opening in his mind. The first letter he wrote was to his daughter, Mercy, who had been sold to a plantation in Alabama when she was 12. He had no idea if she was still alive, if she remembered him, or if the letter would ever reach her. But the act of forming those words on paper, "My dear daughter, I pray this finds you well and free," felt like a kind of prayer reaching across the void that slavery had carved between them. When the contraband camp was dissolved in the spring of 1865, Ezekiel had faced another choice. Many of the freed slaves were heading north, seeking opportunities in cities like Philadelphia and New York. Others were accepting contracts to work plantations in Mississippi and Louisiana, drawn by promises of good wages that often proved empty. But Ezekiel felt pulled back toward Millerville, toward the land where his wife and children were buried, toward unfinished business that tugged at his conscience like a persistent ache. He had used his savings to purchase a small plot of land from a Confederate widow desperate for cash. The soil was rocky and poor, but it was his, and he worked it with the intensity of a man making up for lost time. During the day, he labored at the sawmill, operating machinery that could claim a finger or a hand from a moment's inattention. At night, he tended his garden, repaired his cabin, and continued his education by lamplight. The work was hard, but it was honest work performed for honest wages. No overseer stood behind him with a whip. No master counted his hours or questioned his methods. If he chose to take a break, he took one. If he decided to work late, the extra effort benefited no one but himself. These small freedoms, invisible to those who had never lacked them, felt precious beyond measure, but freedom had brought unexpected burdens as well. In slavery, his survival had depended on reading the moods and motivations of white people, on anticipating their needs and avoiding their anger. These skills served him well in freedom, but they also made him acutely aware of the currents of resentment flowing beneath the surface of Reconstruction era Georgia. Many white Southerners viewed the freed slaves not as liberated human beings, but as property that had been stolen from them. They spoke of the natural order and racial destiny with the fervor of religious conviction. Secret organizations had begun forming groups of masked riders who visited the homes of freedmen in the dark hours before dawn, delivering messages. Through violence and intimidation, Ezekiel had heard the stories. Samuel Johnson, beaten nearly to death for trying to vote in the last election. The Williams family, driven from their farm after their cotton crop proved more successful than their white neighbors expected. The schoolhouse in Oaktown burned to the ground 3 days after it opened its doors to colored children. The message was clear. Freedom might be the law, but it was not necessarily the reality. The war had ended slavery as a legal institution, but it had not ended the attitudes and assumptions that had made slavery possible. In many ways, the struggle was just beginning. Ezekiel had tried to keep his head down, to avoid drawing attention to himself or his modest success. He attended the Colored Methodist Church on Sundays, but stayed away from political meetings. He treated white customers at the sawmill with careful deference, never allowing his competence to seem like pride or his self-possession to be mistaken for arrogance. But neutrality, he was learning, was a luxury that men like him could not afford. The simple act of existing as a free black man in Georgia was itself a political statement, a challenge to the racial hierarchy that many whites were determined to restore. His literacy, his property ownership, his refusal to bow and scrape, all of these marked him as dangerous in the eyes of those who preferred their former slaves grateful and subservient. The warning had come 3 weeks earlier, delivered by young Timothy Fletcher, the son of the sawmill owner. Timothy was different from his father, more educated, less wedded to the old ways, genuinely troubled by the violence that seemed to follow emancipation like a shadow. He had sought out Ezekiel after work, his face pale with worry. "There's talk," Timothy had said, glancing around to make sure they weren't overheard, "about you and some of the other freedmen. They say you're getting too comfortable, forgetting your place." Ezekiel had felt his stomach tighten, but his expression remained calm. "Who's talking, Mr. Timothy? Does it matter? You know how these things work. Talk becomes action, and action becomes—" Timothy had trailed off, unable to say the word that hung between them like a blade. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Violence, the word that defined the space between slavery and freedom, the threat that shadowed every step toward equality. Ezekiel had seen enough of it to know that Timothy's warning was not idle gossip, but a genuine alert. The question was, what to do with it? He could run, pack his few possessions, and head north as so many others had done. The underground networks that had helped escaped slaves during the war still functioned, now assisting freedmen fleeing Southern violence. A man with his skills could find work in a northern city, could disappear into the anonymous crowds of industrial workers seeking better lives, but running felt like surrender, like allowing fear to dictate the boundaries of his existence. He had bought his land with honest money and honest labor. He had broken no laws, harmed no one, asked for nothing more than the right to work and live in peace. To flee now would be to accept that freedom was conditional, that his rights existed only at the sufferance of those who had once owned him. So he had stayed, but with heightened vigilance. He varied his routes home from work, avoided traveling alone after dark, and kept his rifle loaded and within easy reach. Sleep came in fragments, interrupted by every unusual sound, the crack of a branch, the distant whinny of a horse, the whisper of wind through dry leaves that might or might not be footsteps. It was during one of these restless nights that he had heard the commotion from town. Voices raised in anger, the sound of horses moving fast, the distant glow of torches against the darkness. By morning, the news had spread through the colored community like wildfire. Marcus Whitfield had been arrested on charges of murder and treason. The details emerged slowly, filtered through layers of rumor and speculation. 3 freedmen had been found dead in the woods outside town, their bodies bearing the marks of extreme violence. Witnesses placed Whitfield at the scene. Documents found in his possession suggested connections to organized resistance against Reconstruction policies. The federal authorities had acted swiftly, taking him into custody before local sympathizers could interfere. The trial had been brief and by most accounts fair. The evidence was overwhelming, the witnesses credible, the judge a federal appointee from Ohio unburdened by local prejudices. Marcus Whitfield had been convicted and sentenced to hang, his execution scheduled for the following Friday. Ezekiel had felt no satisfaction at the news, only a deep weariness that seemed to settle in his bones like winter cold. This was not justice, it was the continuation of a cycle of violence that had already claimed too many lives. Whitfield's death would solve nothing, would heal no wounds, would bring back none of the men who had died by his hand. But it was the law, and the law had to mean something if freedom was to mean anything at all. The same legal system that had once protected slavery now condemned those who would use violence to restore it. Progress was possible, even if it came at the pace of erosion rather than avalanche. Or so Ezekiel had told himself as he sat on his porch, mending nets and trying not to think about the man who would die in 3 days. Marcus Whitfield had been a cruel master, but he had also been the only father figure Ezekiel had ever known. The relationship had been twisted by the institution that shaped it, but it had been a relationship nonetheless complex, contradictory, and impossible to dismiss with simple hatred. Tomorrow, Ezekiel knew he would have to make another choice. He could attend the execution as so many other freedmen planned to do, bearing witness to what they saw as a moment of historical justice. He could stay away, refusing to participate in what felt uncomfortably like revenge. Or he could do something else entirely, something that would require courage of a different kind. In his coat pocket, wrapped in oiled cloth, lay a document that could change everything. He had debated for days whether to reveal it, knowing that the decision would define not just Whitfield's fate, but his own character. The weight of that choice pressed down on him like the weight of all the choices he had never been allowed to make, all the decisions that had been stolen from him by the accident of his birth and the color of his skin. The rope would swing tomorrow unless he acted tonight. And in the morning, the whole county would learn what kind of man Ezekiel Washington truly was, not the man slavery had tried to make him, but the man freedom had allowed him to become. The midnight oil burned low as Ezekiel unfolded the yellowed paper for the 100th time, his eyes tracing words that could either damn a man or save him. The document had come into his possession through channels he could never reveal, passed along a network of servants and stable hands who moved through white society like shadows, invisible but always listening. What they had overheard in drawing rooms and whispered in kitchens had eventually reached him, along with proof that challenged everything the prosecution claimed to know about Marcus Whitfield's crimes. The letter bore the seal of Colonel James Morrison, a Union officer who had served as military governor of the region during the chaotic months following the war's end. Morrison's handwriting was precise, each word carefully chosen to document an arrangement that both men had hoped would remain buried forever. The correspondence detailed a secret agreement between Whitfield and federal authorities, a bargain struck in desperation that had saved dozens of lives while destroying Whitfield's reputation among his own people. According to Morrison's records, Marcus Whitfield had approached Union forces in the winter of 1865, not as a surrendering Confederate, but as an informant. The plantation owner had provided detailed intelligence about organized resistance groups forming throughout central Georgia, identifying leaders, meeting places, and planned attacks against freed slaves and federal personnel. His information had prevented at least 3 massacres and led to the arrest of several key figures in what would later become the Ku Klux Klan. The price of this cooperation had been steep. Whitfield was forced to publicly maintain his Confederate sympathies while secretly undermining them. He attended resistance meetings, contributed money to violent causes, and allowed his property to be used for planning sessions, all while reporting every detail to federal authorities. The men he had betrayed trusted him completely, viewing him as one of their most committed allies in the fight to restore white supremacy. The 3 dead freedmen whose murders had condemned Whitfield to hang had indeed been killed on his property. But according to Morrison's letter, they had been federal informants whose cover had been blown by someone else in the resistance network. Whitfield had been ordered to participate in their execution to maintain his own cover, a choice between revealing himself and losing access to critical intelligence, or allowing 3 men to die to potentially save dozens more. Morrison's final paragraph was the most damning of all. Marcus Whitfield's service to the Union cause has been invaluable, though it must remain classified indefinitely. His sacrifice of personal honor in service of the greater good exemplifies the difficult choices required during these turbulent times. Should circumstances change, this correspondence serves as testimony to his true loyalties and actions. The letter was dated 6 months before the murders. It established a clear timeline of Whitfield's cooperation with federal authorities and provided context that would completely reshape the prosecution's case. But revealing it would expose not only Whitfield's secret role, but also the federal government's willingness to overlook individual crimes in pursuit of larger strategic goals. Ezekiel folded the document carefully, his hands trembling slightly with the weight of what he held. He had spent 3 sleepless nights wrestling with the implications, knowing that his decision would ripple far beyond Whitfield's fate. The white community that had already condemned his former master would see any intervention by a freed slave as the ultimate betrayal. The black community that looked to Whitfield's execution as symbolic justice would view Ezekiel's actions as collaboration with their oppressor. The document had reached him through Martha Hendricks, an elderly woman who had served as housekeeper to Colonel Morrison's family during his tenure as military governor. Martha's discretion was legendary. She had managed the colonel's household during some of the most sensitive negotiations of the Reconstruction period, privy to conversations that could have started wars or prevented them. When Morrison departed for his next posting, he had entrusted certain papers to Martha's care. Knowing that her loyalty transcended political boundaries, Martha had sought out Ezekiel 2 days after Whitfield's conviction, finding him at the sawmill during his lunch break. She was a small woman, barely reaching his shoulder, but she carried herself with the quiet authority of someone who had navigated decades of dangerous secrets without ever being caught. "Got something you need to see," she had said without preamble, glancing around to ensure they weren't observed. "Something about your old master." Ezekiel had hesitated. His connection to Whitfield was already drawing unwanted attention from both communities. Being seen in conversation with Morrison's former housekeeper would only fuel speculation about his loyalties and intentions. "I ain't got nothing to do with Marcus Whitfield anymore," he had replied carefully. "Man made his choices, got to live with the consequences." Martha's eyes had hardened. Boy, don't you dare play simple with me. I have been watching you since you learned to walk, and I know you got more sense than to let pride cloud your judgment. This ain't about what you owe that man or what he owes you. This is about what's right." She had pressed a small bundle into his hands before walking away, leaving him standing in the sawmill yard with what felt like a lit stick of dynamite wrapped in old newspaper. That evening, alone in his cabin, he had discovered Morrison's letter along with a note from Martha explaining how she had come to possess it. The colonel, she wrote, had suffered a stroke while stationed in Alabama and died before he could retrieve his personal papers. His effects had been shipped to his widow in Ohio, but Martha had intercepted certain documents she judged too sensitive for civilian eyes. Morrison's letter about Whitfield was among them, along with correspondence detailing other classified arrangements that could destroy reputations and end careers if made public. Martha's note had concluded with words that haunted Ezekiel's thoughts. Some secrets got to die with the people who made them. But some secrets got to live long enough to save innocent blood. You are smart enough to know the difference. The problem was that Ezekiel wasn't sure he did know the difference. Whitfield's innocence, if it could be called that, was a matter of legal technicality rather than moral clarity. The man had still participated in murder, even if under federal orders. He had still contributed to an organization dedicated to terrorizing freed slaves, even if as a double agent. His hands were no cleaner for having been coerced into violence, but the law was supposed to be about evidence, not emotions. If Whitfield had been acting under federal authority, then his conviction was based on an incomplete understanding of the facts. The prosecution had painted him as a Confederate diehard driven by racial hatred, when the truth was far more complex. Justice required considering all the evidence, even evidence that complicated simple narratives of guilt and innocence. Ezekiel rose from his chair and walked to the window, gazing out at the darkened landscape where he had once labored under Whitfield's authority. The irony was not lost on him that he now held his former master's life in his hands, possessed the power to grant or deny mercy, as Whitfield had once done with him. The reversal felt almost cosmic in its completeness, the slave become the arbiter of the master's fate, but that was precisely why he couldn't let personal history dictate his choice. If he remained silent and allowed Whitfield to hang, would it be justice or revenge? If he spoke up and provided the evidence that could save him, would it be mercy or betrayal of his own people? The questions had no easy answers, only consequences. That would echo through both communities for years to come. He thought about the three men whose deaths had triggered this chain of events. George Patterson, Samuel Reeves, and Benjamin Foster, all freedmen who had worked dangerous jobs as federal informants, gathering intelligence on resistance activities throughout the county. Their families had attended the trial, sitting in the colored section of the courthouse, their faces etched with grief and determination to see their loved one's killer punished. Patterson had been a preacher, one of the first ordained ministers to emerge from the ranks of freed slaves. He had used his position to travel between plantations, ostensibly conducting religious services, but actually documenting threats against black families and federal personnel. Reeves had been a blacksmith whose shop served as an informal meeting place for the black community, making him perfectly positioned to overhear plans and identify troublemakers. Foster had been barely 20 years old, a field hand whose quick wit and ability to read had made him valuable as a courier between informants and their federal handlers. All three had known the risks of their work. All three had accepted those risks because they believed in the promise of Reconstruction, the possibility that federal protection could create space for black advancement in the hostile environment of post-war Georgia. Their deaths had sent shockwaves through the informant network, convincing many other potential allies that cooperation with federal authorities was tantamount to suicide. The prosecution had used their deaths to argue that Whitfield represented everything evil about the Confederate cause, wealthy planter who couldn't accept defeat and was willing to murder innocent men to restore the old order. The narrative was clean, satisfying, and completely false according to Morrison's letter. But would the truth serve justice better than the lie? Revealing Whitfield's role as a federal informant would expose the entire network of spies and double agents that kept the peace in central Georgia. It would compromise ongoing investigations and put other informants at risk. It would also reveal the federal government's willingness to overlook individual crimes in pursuit of strategic objectives, a policy that might be necessary but was hardly heroic. Ezekiel returned to his table and reread Morrison's letter one more time, paying particular attention to the colonel's description of the night the three informants died. According to Morrison's account, Whitfield had been ordered to participate in their execution after another member of the resistance cell had become suspicious of Patterson's activities. Federal authorities had calculated that losing 3 informants was preferable to losing their most valuable source inside the organization. The cold pragmatism of the decision was breathtaking. 3 men had been sacrificed like chess pieces, their lives deemed less valuable than the intelligence Whitfield could provide. Morrison's letter made clear that this choice had tortured Whitfield, who had argued for alternative approaches that might have saved the informants without compromising his cover. But federal authorities had overruled him, insisting that the greater good required accepting individual tragedies. This context didn't absolve Whitfield of responsibility for 3 deaths, but it certainly complicated the question of his guilt. He had been trapped between competing loyalties, forced to choose between maintaining his cover and saving 3 lives. The choice he made was morally questionable, but it had been made under extraordinary circumstances that the jury had never been allowed to consider. The courthouse clock struck 1 in the morning, its chimes carrying across the quiet town like a funeral bell. In 8 hours, Marcus Whitfield would be led to the gallows unless someone intervened. The federal authorities who had once protected him were either dead, transferred, or unwilling to compromise current operations by revealing past arrangements. His Confederate associates had already abandoned him, viewing his conviction as proof that he had always been weak and unreliable. Only Ezekiel possessed the evidence that could save him, and only Ezekiel understood the full complexity of what that salvation would mean. Speaking up would require him to stand before a hostile white community and argue for mercy toward a man they wanted to see dead. It would require him to face the black community and explain why he was protecting someone they viewed as a murderer. It would require him to expose secrets that powerful people wanted to keep buried, making him a target for retribution from multiple directions. But silence felt like complicity in a different kind of injustice. If Whitfield hanged for crimes he had committed under federal orders, then the rule of law meant nothing. If evidence was ignored because it was inconvenient or politically damaging, then trials became mere theater performed for public satisfaction rather than genuine quests for truth. Ezekiel had fought too hard for his freedom to watch it undermined by the very legal system that was supposed to protect it. Equal justice under law was more than a motto, it was the foundation upon which everything else was built. Without it, rights became privileges, and privileges could be revoked whenever public opinion demanded it. He thought about the white dress that Shia had worn to church in the story he had heard told around campfires, how she had chosen to be seen rather than hidden. This moment required a similar kind of courage, the willingness to stand up not because it was easy or popular, but because it was right. Dawn was still 3 hours away when Ezekiel made his decision. He folded Morrison's letter carefully and placed it in his coat pocket, then began composing a statement that would accompany it. His handwriting was still labored, each letter formed with deliberate care, but the words came easily once he started. He had spent his entire life being told what to think and say and do. Now, for perhaps the first time, he would speak entirely for himself. The statement was brief but comprehensive. It outlined how he had come to possess Morrison's letter, acknowledged the complexity of the moral questions it raised, and argued that a jury deserved to consider all available evidence before rendering final judgment. He didn't claim that Whitfield was innocent, only that his guilt was more nuanced than the prosecution had suggested. Most importantly, he accepted full responsibility for his decision to come forward. Whatever consequences followed, and he had no illusions that there wouldn't be consequences, he would face them as a free man making a free choice. That, perhaps, was what freedom really meant, not the absence of difficult decisions, but the right to make them according to your own conscience rather than someone else's expectations. As the eastern sky began to lighten with the first hints of dawn, Ezekiel Washington prepared to save the life of the man who had once owned him. Not out of loyalty or affection, but out of a commitment to justice that transcended personal history. The rope might still swing before the day was done, but it would not swing because evidence had been hidden, or truth had been sacrificed to satisfy public bloodlust. He dressed carefully in his best clothes, the same outfit he wore to church and to important business meetings. If he was going to stand before the most powerful men in the county and challenge their version of justice, he would do it with dignity intact and spine straight. The boy who had cowered before white authority was gone, replaced by a man who understood that true freedom meant accepting responsibility for moral choices, regardless of their cost. The walk to town would take an hour in the pre-dawn darkness. By the time he reached the courthouse, the sun would be rising on what promised to be the most important day of his life, and possibly the last day of Marcus Whitfield's. The morning mist clung to Millerville's main street like reluctant ghosts, swirling around the hitching posts and wooden sidewalks as the town stirred to life. Shop owners emerged to sweep their storefronts, their movements mechanical and subdued, as if the weight of the day's grim ceremony had settled into their very bones. Today was execution day, and the entire community seemed to move under the shadow of the gallows that dominated the courthouse square. Ezekiel approached the town's outskirts just as the church bells chimed 6 o'clock, their bronze voices carrying across fields where cotton still waited to be picked. The sound reminded him of Sunday mornings during slavery, when attendance at the white church had been mandatory for house servants, though they were relegated to a cramped balcony where the summer heat was suffocating and the winter cold bit through their thin clothing. He had listened to countless sermons about obedience and humility, about accepting one's station in life as God's will, never imagining that one day he would walk into that same town as a free man, carrying evidence that could overturn a federal court's judgment. The first person he encountered was Dr. Edmund Carruthers, a thin man with prematurely gray hair who had served as the county's physician for over 20 years. Carruthers had been one of the few white men to treat enslaved people with something approaching professional respect, though he had never questioned the institution that made his services necessary. The doctor was emerging from his buggy, medical bag in hand, likely returning from a night call to one of the outlying farms. Their eyes met across the empty street, and Ezekiel saw surprise flicker across the doctor's weathered features. It was unusual for any freedman to be in town this early, particularly on a day when racial tensions ran higher than usual. But Carruthers merely nodded, a small gesture that acknowledged Ezekiel's presence without the hostility that such recognition might have carried from other white residents. "Morning, Dr. Carruthers," Ezekiel said, touching the brim of his hat with the careful politeness that had become second nature. Every interaction with white authority required this delicate balance between respect and self-respect, between acknowledging their power while asserting his own humanity. "Ezekiel," the doctor replied, his voice carrying a note of cautious curiosity, "you're up early for a day like this. Most of your people are staying clear of town until the business is finished." The phrase "your people" rankled, but Ezekiel let it pass. More important battles lay ahead, and he couldn't afford to waste energy on every casual reminder of how some whites still viewed the world in terms of rigid racial categories. Got business at the courthouse, Ezekiel replied simply. Can't wait for more convenient times. Dr. Carruthers studied him for a moment, and something in his expression suggested he sensed there was more to this early morning visit than routine legal matters. But the doctor had survived decades in a small southern town by knowing when not to ask questions, and he simply nodded again before heading toward his office. The encounter left Ezekiel acutely aware of how his presence would be interpreted throughout the day. To some, he would be seen as a former slave come to witness his master's execution, either gloating over fallen white authority or paying reluctant respects to a man who had once controlled his destiny. To others, he might represent something more threatening, a freedman who had grown too comfortable with his liberty, too willing to insert himself into white affairs. Neither interpretation was accurate, but both carried dangers. The first might earn him contempt but probably wouldn't provoke violence. The second could make him a target for the same forces that had claimed the lives of countless other freedmen who had been deemed uppity or insufficiently deferential to the restored social order. Main Street began filling with early risers. As Ezekiel made his way toward the courthouse, Henderson's general store was already open, its proprietor arranging barrels of flour and coffee beans on the front porch. Two women in dark dresses hurried past, their voices hushed but their excitement barely contained. Execution days drew crowds from across the county, turning solemn legal proceedings into something uncomfortably close to public entertainment. The barbershop was busy despite the early hour, with several men gathered around the stove discussing the day's events. Through the window, Ezekiel could see animated gestures and hear fragments of conversation that suggested opinions about Marcus Whitfield's fate were far from unanimous. Some voices argued that hanging was too good for a man who had betrayed the South by murdering fellow Confederates. Others contended that Whitfield was being scapegoated for the failures of federal Reconstruction policies. None of them knew the truth, Ezekiel realized. They were debating the merits of executing a traitor and murderer, unaware that the man they wanted to hang had actually been working for the federal government all along. The irony was bitter. Whitfield was being condemned by his former allies for crimes he had committed on behalf of his former enemies, while both sides remained ignorant of the complex loyalties that had driven his actions. Near the courthouse steps, a small group of freedmen had gathered, their presence both defiant and nervous. Ezekiel recognized most of them, field workers and domestic servants who had gained their freedom along with him, men and women who saw Whitfield's execution as a symbolic victory in their ongoing struggle for dignity and safety. They had come to witness what they hoped would be justice for the three murdered informants, unaware that the truth was far more complicated than the prosecution had suggested. Among them stood Jeremiah Bass, a carpenter whose skill with wood had earned him steady work despite white resentment of his success. Jeremiah had been born free in North Carolina, but had moved to Georgia during Reconstruction, drawn by opportunities that seemed to exist nowhere else in the South. His presence in the group lent it credibility as a man who had never been enslaved. His opinions carried weight that others sometimes lacked. "Ezekiel," Jeremiah called out, waving him over. "Didn't expect to see you here today. Figured you'd want to stay clear of all this fuss." The invitation forced Ezekiel to make an immediate choice. He could join the group and blend into the crowd of freedmen who had come to witness what they saw as justice. Or he could continue alone toward his confrontation with federal authority, revealing his true purpose and risking alienation from his own community. He chose a middle path, approaching the group, but maintaining some distance. "Morning, Jeremiah." "Everyone." The greetings were warm but curious. These men and women had known him during slavery, had watched him navigate the dangerous waters between white authority and black resistance. They respected his intelligence and his ability to survive in hostile environments, but they also knew he had been closer to the master class than most slaves, trusted with responsibilities that set him apart from the field hands and domestic workers. Strange business, ain't it? said Clara Washington, an elderly woman who had worked in the Whitfield kitchen for 30 years before emancipation. Despite sharing Ezekiel's surname, a coincidence of naming conventions rather than family connection, she had always maintained a careful distance from him, viewing his privileged position with suspicion. "How strange do you mean strange?" Ezekiel asked, though he suspected he knew where this conversation was heading. "White man killing other white men over us," Clara explained, her voice carrying decades of accumulated wariness. "Don't seem natural. Somehow, usually when white folks die, they find a way to blame us for it." Several others nodded agreement. The logic was sound based on their collective experience. Throughout slavery and into freedom, white violence against blacks had been routine and largely unpunished. But violence between whites, particularly when it involved questions of racial politics, was treated as a serious crime requiring serious consequences. "Maybe things are changing," suggested a younger man named David Perry, who had taught himself to read using discarded newspapers. "Maybe federal law means something now, even when it goes against local customs." "Or maybe," Clara replied with the skepticism of someone who had seen too many false dawns, "they are just using this man as an example. Show everyone what happens when you go too far, even if you're white." The conversation was moving in directions that made Ezekiel increasingly uncomfortable. These people saw Whitfield's execution as proof that the federal government was serious about protecting freedmen's rights. Revealing the truth about his federal connections would shatter that belief, replacing hope with cynicism about government manipulation and moral compromise, but allowing them to maintain their illusions felt equally wrong. They deserved to understand the real forces shaping their world, even if that understanding was painful and complicated. The question was whether this was the right time and place for such revelations. "You've been mighty quiet, Ezekiel," Jeremiah observed. "What are you thinking about all this?" Before Ezekiel could respond, a commotion near the courthouse entrance drew everyone's attention. A well-dressed man in a dark suit was arguing with the federal marshal who controlled access to the building. Even from a distance, it was clear that the visitor was demanding something the marshal was reluctant to provide. "That's Judge Pemberton from Augusta," David whispered. "Heard he was coming to make sure everything was done proper like." Judge Harold Pemberton was a federal appointee whose reputation for fairness had earned him grudging respect even from former Confederates. His presence suggested that higher authorities were taking unusual interest in Whitfield's case, though whether that boded well or ill for the condemned man was unclear. The argument ended with the judge being admitted to the courthouse, his bearing suggesting he was accustomed to getting his way in legal matters. Whatever business had brought him to Millerville at this early hour was clearly urgent, and Ezekiel felt a flutter of possibility that perhaps his intervention might not be necessary after all, but the feeling faded as quickly as it had emerged. Whatever Pemberton's business, it was unlikely to involve Morrison's letter or the federal intelligence operations that had shaped Whitfield's actions. The judge would be working with the same incomplete information that had convicted Whitfield in the first place. "I should get going," Ezekiel announced, stepping back from the group. "Got business to attend to before the ceremony starts." Clara's eyes narrowed. "What kind of business you got at the courthouse, Ezekiel? You ain't involved in this mess, are you?" The question carried an undertone of accusation that made several others look at him with sudden suspicion. During slavery, house servants like Ezekiel had often been viewed with mistrust by field hands who suspected them of reporting conversations and activities to their masters. Freedom had not entirely erased those divisions, and his current behavior was triggering old suspicions about where his ultimate loyalties lay. "Just paying my respects," he replied carefully. "Man was my master for 27 years. Got complicated feelings about seeing him hang." It was an honest answer, if an incomplete one, but it seemed to satisfy most of the group, who nodded with understanding. The relationships between enslaved people and their owners had indeed been complicated, mixing hatred and dependence, resistance and accommodation in ways that outsiders often found difficult to comprehend. Only Clara continued to watch him with skeptical eyes as he walked away. She had always been perceptive about human motivations, able to read the subtle signs that revealed people's true intentions. Whatever she suspected about his purpose, she kept it to herself, but Ezekiel could feel her gaze following him as he approached the courthouse steps. The building itself was imposing despite its modest size, constructed of red brick with white columns that were meant to evoke classical ideals of justice and democracy. During slavery, it had been a place where human beings were bought and sold, along with livestock and farming equipment. Now it served as the center of federal authority in the region, a symbol of how the law could evolve, even when human attitudes remained stubbornly unchanged. Two guards flanked the main entrance, both federal soldiers whose blue uniforms marked them as outsiders in a community that still harbored deep resentment toward occupying forces. They watched Ezekiel's approach with professional alertness, their hands resting casually on their sidearms in the universal posture of men prepared for trouble. "Morning," the senior guard said as Ezekiel reached the bottom of the steps. "Courts not in session today. Just the execution scheduled for 10 o'clock. I need to speak with Judge Pemberton," Ezekiel replied, his voice steady despite the nervousness that made his palms sweat. "Got evidence relevant to the Whitfield case." The guards exchanged glances. It was unusual for any civilian to request an audience with a federal judge, particularly on the morning of an execution. It was even more unusual for that civilian to be a freedman carrying what appeared to be official documents. "What kind of evidence?" the junior guard asked, his tone suggesting skepticism but not outright dismissal. Ezekiel reached slowly into his coat pocket, mindful that sudden movements might be misinterpreted. He withdrew Morrison's letter along with his own written statement, holding them where both guards could see them clearly. "Federal correspondence that bears on the case," he said simply. "Judge needs to see it before the execution proceeds." The senior guard stepped forward and examined the documents without taking them from Ezekiel's hands. His eyes widened slightly as he recognized the official federal seal on Morrison's letter, and his demeanor shifted from casual authority to genuine attention. "Wait here," he instructed, then disappeared into the courthouse with quick steps that suggested urgency. Ezekiel remained on the steps, acutely aware that his presence was drawing attention from passers-by. Word would spread quickly through the town that a freedman was seeking an audience with the federal judge on execution morning. By noon, regardless of what happened next, his actions would be the subject of intense speculation and probably considerable hostility. The guard returned within minutes, his expression unreadable. "Judge will see you," he announced, "but make it quick. He's got other business to attend to before the ceremony." As Ezekiel climbed the courthouse steps, he caught sight of Clara Washington across the square, her eyes still fixed on him with unmistakable suspicion. Behind her, the gallows waited in the morning sun, its shadow falling across the place where Marcus Whitfield would stand in 4 hours unless the truth could somehow set him free. Judge Harold Pemberton's temporary office occupied the courthouse's most austere room, furnished with little more than a massive oak desk, 2 straight-backed chairs, and a portrait of Abraham Lincoln that seemed to preside over all proceedings with marble eyes. The morning light filtered through tall windows, casting geometric shadows across legal documents that covered every available surface. Pemberton himself was a compact man in his 50s, with steel-gray hair and the kind of penetrating gaze that came from decades of separating truth from deception in courtrooms across the federal circuit. He looked up as Ezekiel entered, and his expression revealed neither surprise nor prejudice, only the professional curiosity of a jurist confronted with an unexpected development. The judge had been studying a thick file when the guard announced his visitor, and the papers remained spread before him like pieces of an unfinished puzzle. "You are Ezekiel Washington," Pemberton said, his voice carrying the precise diction. "Of formal education." It was not a question but a statement that suggested he had already gathered considerable information about his unexpected visitor. "Yes, sir," Ezekiel replied, removing his hat and holding it against his chest. The gesture was respectful, but not subservient, the posture of a free man, acknowledging authority without surrendering dignity. "My guard tells me you possess federal correspondence relevant to the Whitfield case," Pemberton continued, gesturing toward the chair opposite his desk. "That is a serious claim to make on the morning of a man's execution." Ezekiel sat carefully, placing Morrison's letter and his own statement on the desk between them. "Yes, sir." Documents that shed new light on the circumstances surrounding those murders. Pemberton picked up Morrison's letter first, his trained eye immediately recognizing the official seal and letterhead. As he read, his expression underwent subtle changes, a slight tightening around the eyes, a barely perceptible straightening of the shoulders. When he finished, he set the letter down with deliberate care and reached for Ezekiel's statement. "This correspondence is dated 6 months before the murders," the judge observed, his tone neutral but his attention clearly focused. "It establishes a timeline that could fundamentally alter our understanding of Mr. Whitfield's actions." "Yes, sir. That's why I felt obligated to bring it forward." Pemberton leaned back in his chair, his fingers steepled as he studied Ezekiel with renewed interest. "You understand the implications of what you're presenting. This document suggests that Marcus Whitfield was operating as a federal informant, that the murders he was convicted of committing were carried out under federal authority." "I understand that it complicates things considerably," Ezekiel replied carefully. "But the law ought to be based on all the facts, not just the ones that make for a tidy story." A brief smile crossed the judge's features, not of amusement, but of recognition. Here was a man who understood the fundamental principles of jurisprudence, regardless of his formal education or social status. "Indeed," Pemberton agreed. "Though, I must ask how you came to possess correspondence marked as classified federal material. That is not information typically available to private citizens." Ezekiel had anticipated this question and had prepared his answer carefully. "It came to me through Martha Hendricks, who served as housekeeper to Colonel Morrison during his time as military governor. She felt the information was too important to remain hidden when a man's life was at stake. Mrs. Hendricks took considerable risk in preserving these documents," Pemberton noted. "Federal classification exists for good reasons, usually involving ongoing operations or the safety of personnel still in the field." "Yes, sir." But she believed that justice required full disclosure, even when it's inconvenient for those in authority. The judge returned his attention to Morrison's letter, reading certain passages a second time with the thoroughness of someone accustomed to finding devils in details. When he looked up again, his expression had grown even more serious. "According to Colonel Morrison's account, Mr. Whitfield was ordered to participate in the execution of 3 federal informants whose cover had been compromised. The alternative was exposing his own role and losing access to critical intelligence about organized resistance activities." "That's my understanding of the situation," Ezekiel confirmed. "You realize that this information, if verified, would require setting aside a federal court conviction. The legal and political ramifications would extend far beyond this courthouse." Ezekiel met the judge's gaze directly. "I realize that truth is sometimes inconvenient, Your Honor, but I was taught that inconvenience isn't grounds for ignoring evidence." Pemberton stood and walked to the window, gazing out at the gallows that dominated the courthouse square. A crowd was already beginning to gather despite the early hour, drawn by the mixture of civic duty and morbid curiosity that attended public executions. Among them, Ezekiel could see both white and black faces, though the two groups maintained careful separation even in their shared interest in the day's proceedings. There's another dimension to this situation that you may not have considered, the judge said without turning from the window. If Mr. Whitfield was indeed operating under federal authority, then his conviction serves certain political purposes. It demonstrates federal commitment to protecting freedmen's rights, even when the perpetrator is a white landowner with Confederate sympathies. The statement hung in the air like an accusation. Pemberton was suggesting that higher authorities might prefer to let Whitfield hang rather than complicate the narrative of federal protection for freed slaves. It was a cynical calculation, but one that made perfect sense in the complex political environment of Reconstruction. Are you saying the federal government would execute an innocent man for political convenience? Ezekiel asked, though he suspected he already knew the answer. I'm saying that individual justice and political necessity don't always align, Pemberton replied, turning back to face him. The question becomes whether we serve the law or allow the law to serve other masters. It was a remarkable admission from a federal judge, an acknowledgement that the system he represented was capable of profound moral compromise. But it also suggested that Pemberton was wrestling with the same ethical questions that had tormented Ezekiel through 3 sleepless nights. A knock at the door interrupted their conversation. The guard entered without waiting for permission, his face flushed with urgency. Your Honor, there's been a development. Attorney General's office in Atlanta sent a telegram. They're requesting immediate consultation before the execution proceeds. Pemberton frowned. What sort of consultation? Didn't say, sir. Just that new information has come to light that requires review at the highest levels. The judge and Ezekiel exchanged glances. It seemed unlikely that this development was unrelated to Morrison's letter, though how federal authorities in Atlanta had learned of its existence remained a mystery. When did this telegram arrive? Pemberton asked. Just now, sir. Telegraph operator brought it over personally. Pemberton studied the message, his expression growing increasingly grave as he read. When he finished, he folded the telegram carefully and placed it in his coat pocket. It appears that certain classified operations are still considered active, he said to Ezekiel. The Attorney General's office is sending a representative to review all evidence before any final decisions are made. How long will that take? Ezekiel asked, though he suspected the answer would not be encouraging. The representative is traveling by special train from Atlanta. He should arrive within 2 hours, assuming no delays. 2 hours. The execution was scheduled for 10 o'clock, less than 3 hours away. Even if the federal representative arrived on schedule, there would be barely enough time to review the evidence and reach a decision before the appointed time. What happens to Mr. Whitfield? In the meantime, Ezekiel pressed. He remains in custody pending final determination, Pemberton replied. The execution will be postponed until all relevant authorities have had the opportunity to assess the situation. It was a reprieve, though possibly a temporary one. If federal authorities decided that political considerations outweighed individual justice, Whitfield would still hang. Just a few hours later than originally scheduled, another knock interrupted their discussion. This time the visitor was Sheriff Clayton Burke, a heavy-set man whose red face suggested either recent exertion or considerable agitation. Burke had served as county sheriff for 8 years, navigating the treacherous waters between local sentiment and federal authority with the skill of a practiced politician. Judge Pemberton, Burke began without preamble, we've got a situation developing out there. Word spreading that the execution might be delayed, and folks are getting restless. Some are saying the federal government is going soft on Confederate killers. Through the window, Ezekiel could see that the crowd had indeed grown larger and more agitated. What had begun as orderly gathering was taking on the characteristics of an angry mob, with animated gestures and raised voices suggesting that patience was wearing thin. The law requires that all evidence be properly evaluated, Pemberton replied calmly. The crowd's convenience is not a factor in judicial proceedings. With respect, Your Honor, the crowd's mood could become a factor in public safety, Burke countered. These people came expecting to see justice done. If they think the federal government is protecting a Confederate murderer, there's no telling what might happen. It was a barely veiled threat, delivered with the practiced diplomacy of someone accustomed to translating mob sentiment into official pressure. Burke was suggesting that civil order depended on proceeding with the execution as scheduled, regardless of new evidence or federal review. Are you telling me that you cannot maintain order in your own county, Sheriff? Pemberton asked, his tone carrying a subtle challenge. I'm telling you that maintaining order becomes a lot harder when people think the system is rigged against them, Burke replied. Folks around here have seen enough carpetbagger justice to be suspicious of last-minute federal interventions. The exchange revealed the fundamental tension that defined Reconstruction politics. Federal authorities needed local cooperation to implement their policies, but local officials often reflected community attitudes that were hostile to federal objectives. The result was a constant negotiation between competing visions of justice and order. Ezekiel found himself in the uncomfortable position of having triggered a crisis that extended far beyond Whitfield's individual fate. His decision to reveal Morrison's letter had exposed the complex web of secrets and compromises that underpinned federal policy in the region. Now multiple parties were maneuvering to protect their own interests while claiming to serve justice and public safety. Sheriff Burke, Pemberton said finally, I want you to inform the crowd that the execution has been postponed pending review of new evidence. Anyone who attempts to interfere with federal judicial proceedings will face the full consequences of federal law. Burke's face darkened. You're putting me in an impossible position. Judge, these people aren't going to accept another federal delay without some explanation of what's really going on. Then perhaps it's time they learned that justice sometimes requires patience, Pemberton replied. Democracy is not a lynch mob with legal pretensions. The sheriff departed with obvious reluctance, leaving Pemberton and Ezekiel alone to contemplate the forces they had set in motion. Through the window, they could see Burke addressing the crowd, his gesture suggesting he was delivering unwelcome news. The response was immediate, and hostile, angry shouts, raised fists, and a general surge toward the courthouse that was only contained by the presence of federal guards. You've opened a particularly volatile box, Mr. Washington, Pemberton observed. I hope you're prepared for the consequences. I'm prepared to live with whatever follows from telling the truth, Ezekiel replied. The question is whether the federal government is prepared to do the same. Before Pemberton could respond, the telegraph operator burst through the door with another message. This one was marked urgent and addressed directly to the judge. As Pemberton read it, his expression grew increasingly grim. It appears the situation has become even more complicated, he announced. Federal authorities in Washington have been monitoring our proceedings. They're sending a senior official with full authority to make final decisions about Mr. Whitfield's fate. Who's coming? Ezekiel asked, though he wasn't sure he wanted to know. Assistant Attorney General Richard Blackwood, Pemberton replied. A man known for his ability to resolve politically sensitive situations with minimal public disruption. The implication was clear. Blackwood's reputation suggested he was more a politician than jurist, someone who would prioritize federal policy objectives over individual justice. His involvement meant that Whitfield's fate would be decided not by evidence or legal precedent, but by calculations of political advantage and public relations. Ezekiel had saved Marcus Whitfield from immediate execution, but he had also delivered him into the hands of men who viewed justice as a tool of statecraft rather than a principle worth defending. Whether that represented salvation or merely a different form of damnation remained to be seen. Outside, the crowd continued to grow, their voices rising like a storm tide against the courthouse walls. And somewhere in the federal detention cells below, Marcus Whitfield waited to learn whether the truth would set him free or simply provide a more sophisticated justification for his death. The federal detention cell beneath the courthouse was a windowless chamber carved from native stone, its walls weeping moisture that collected in puddles on the uneven floor. Marcus Whitfield sat on a narrow cot that served as the room's only furniture, his hands clasped before him in an attitude that might have been prayer or simply resignation. At 63, he looked far older than his years, his once commanding presence diminished by weeks of confinement and the psychological weight of impending death. When the guard unlocked his cell door and announced that he had a visitor, Whitfield assumed it would be the chaplain making his final rounds. Instead, he found himself face to face with Ezekiel Washington, a man he had not seen since the chaotic days of Sherman's March 3 years earlier. The shock of recognition hit him like a physical blow, and for a moment neither man spoke. "Ezekiel," Whitfield said finally, his voice carrying a complex mixture of surprise, wariness, and something that might have been relief. "I didn't expect to see you again, especially not here." "Mr. Marcus," Ezekiel replied, using the form of address that had been required during slavery, but now felt strange on his tongue. "I came because there's things that need saying before this business goes any further." The guard withdrew to a respectful distance, but remained within earshot, his presence a reminder that this conversation was taking place under federal scrutiny. Both men were acutely aware that their words might be recorded and later used for purposes they couldn't anticipate. Whitfield gestured toward the stone wall beside his cot, the closest thing to a chair the cell offered. "Sit, if you're willing. Though I understand if you prefer to stand. Free men don't have to take orders from the condemned." There was bitter irony in the statement, an acknowledgement of how completely their positions had reversed. During slavery, Whitfield had possessed absolute authority over Ezekiel's body and labor. Now Ezekiel held evidence that could determine whether Whitfield lived or died, making him the more powerful of the two despite the color of his skin. Ezekiel settled against the wall, maintaining enough distance to preserve dignity while allowing for private conversation. "I know about Colonel Morrison's letter," he said without preamble. "Know about the work you were doing for the federal government." Whitfield's face went pale. For weeks he had maintained his silence about his role as a federal informant, accepting conviction and death sentence rather than reveal information that might compromise ongoing operations. Now that silence had been broken by the last person he would have expected to possess such knowledge. "How?" he asked simply. "Martha Hendricks felt the truth ought to come out before you swing," Ezekiel explained. "She gave me Morrison's correspondence, along with her own account of what she witnessed during his time as military governor." Whitfield closed his eyes and leaned back against the stone wall. Martha always did have an inconvenient sense of justice. "I should have known she wouldn't let sleeping secrets lie." "Why didn't you tell them?" Ezekiel asked. "When they put you on trial, why didn't you explain what really happened that night?" The question hung between them like an accusation. Whitfield had chosen martyrdom over revelation, accepting death rather than exposing the complex web of loyalties and betrayals that had shaped his actions during the brutal transition from war to peace. "Because some secrets are worth dying for," Whitfield replied after a long pause. "Because revealing my role would have destroyed the network that Morrison spent 2 years building. Because other men are still out there, still doing work that keeps this region from exploding into open warfare." It was an answer that revealed the depth of Whitfield's commitment to his federal mission, but it also raised uncomfortable questions about the moral calculus that had guided his choices. How many lives was a secret worth? How much individual suffering was justified by larger strategic objectives? "Those 3 men who died," Ezekiel pressed. "Patterson, Reeves, and Foster. They were federal informants too, weren't they?" Whitfield nodded slowly. "Good men, brave men. They knew the risks when they accepted their assignments, just as I knew. Mine when Morrison first approached me. But you were the one who killed them. The statement was not an accusation, but a request for clarification, an attempt to understand the precise nature of Whitfield's culpability. Even with Morrison's letter providing context, the moral dimensions of the case remained murky. I was ordered to participate in their execution to maintain my cover, Whitfield confirmed. The resistance cell had become suspicious of Patterson's activities. If I had refused to join the killing, they would have known I was compromised, and the entire operation would have collapsed. So you chose to save your mission by sacrificing 3 lives. I chose to follow orders that I believed served the greater good, Whitfield corrected. Morrison calculated that losing 3 informants was preferable to losing our primary source inside the resistance organization. I disagreed with that calculation, but I wasn't the one making strategic decisions. The distinction was important, but hardly absolving. Whitfield had been a willing participant in murder, even if that participation had been motivated by federal objectives rather than personal hatred. The law typically didn't recognize superior orders as justification for killing innocent people. Though wartime operations sometimes existed in moral gray areas where normal rules didn't apply. What did you think when you saw me walk into this courthouse this morning? Ezekiel asked, shifting the conversation in a more personal direction. Whitfield studied his former slave with eyes that had grown increasingly shrewd during their conversation. I thought you had come to watch me hang. Most of your people see this as justice for decades of oppression. And what do you think now? Now I think you're here because you believe in something larger than revenge, Whitfield replied. Though, I'm not sure what that something is. Ezekiel was quiet for a moment, gathering his thoughts before attempting to explain motivations that he wasn't entirely sure he understood himself. I believe in the law, he said finally. Not the law that kept me in chains, but the law that set me free. The law that says evidence matters more than convenience, truth matters more than politics. Even when that truth is complicated, even when it doesn't provide the clear moral narrative that people want. Especially then, Ezekiel replied, simple truths don't need protecting. It's the complicated ones that require courage to defend. Above them, the sound of boots on wooden floors suggested considerable activity in the courthouse. Voices were raised in urgent discussion, and the rhythm of movement indicated that multiple parties were converging on the building. The federal representative from Atlanta had apparently arrived, bringing with him whatever authority was necessary to resolve Whitfield's fate. You know, this might not change anything, Whitfield observed. Federal authorities might decide that political considerations outweigh individual justice. They might conclude that my death serves their purposes better than my life. Maybe, Ezekiel acknowledged. But at least they'll be making that choice with all the facts, not just the ones that fit their preferred story. And if they decide to proceed with the execution anyway, if they determine that revealing my federal connections would cause more problems than it solves, Ezekiel met his former master's gaze directly. Then you'll hang knowing that someone tried to tell the truth about what really happened. Sometimes that's all justice can offer, the knowledge that truth was spoken, even if it wasn't heard. The philosophical exchange was interrupted by the arrival of Judge Pemberton, whose grave expression suggested that the federal consultation had not gone well. Behind him walked a tall man in expensive suit whose bearing screamed federal authority. Despite his civilian dress, this could only be Assistant Attorney General Blackwood, the political operative sent to manage a situation that had grown too complex for local resolution. Mr. Whitfield, Pemberton announced formally, Assistant Attorney General Blackwood has reviewed all available evidence in your case. He's prepared to render a final decision regarding your sentence. Blackwood stepped forward, his pale blue eyes moving between Whitfield and Ezekiel with the calculating gaze of someone accustomed to measuring human value in terms of political utility. He was younger than Ezekiel had expected, probably in his early 40s, with the kind of polished confidence that came from navigating Washington's corridors of power. "Mr. Washington," Blackwood said, acknowledging Ezekiel's presence with a slight nod. "I understand we have you to thank for bringing certain classified materials to our attention." The phrasing was diplomatic, but carried an undertone of displeasure. Blackwood clearly viewed Ezekiel's intervention as an unwelcome complication, rather than a service to justice. "I brought forward evidence that seemed relevant to the case," Ezekiel replied carefully. "Seemed like the court ought to have all the facts before making final decisions." "Indeed," Blackwood agreed, though his tone suggested he found civilian concepts of judicial thoroughness somewhat naive. "However, the materials you provided raise complex questions of national security and ongoing operations that extend far beyond this particular case." Whitfield straightened on his cot, recognizing the language of bureaucratic evasion. "You're going to proceed with the execution anyway, aren't you?" Despite the evidence of my federal service, Blackwood's expression didn't change. "The federal government has carefully reviewed all aspects of your situation, Mr. Whitfield. We acknowledge your previous cooperation with military authorities and appreciate the difficult circumstances under which you operated." "But," Whitfield prompted, "but we have concluded that revealing the true nature of your activities would compromise ongoing security operations and potentially endanger other personnel still in the field. The classified nature of your federal service unfortunately precludes its use in your legal defense." It was exactly what Ezekiel had feared, a decision based on political calculation rather than legal principle. The federal government was prepared to execute a man for crimes he had committed under their orders, rather than risk exposing intelligence operations that might be compromised by full disclosure. "So you're going to kill him to protect your secrets?" Ezekiel said, his voice carrying barely controlled anger. "We're going to proceed with a lawfully obtained conviction based on evidence properly presented at trial," Blackwood corrected. "Mr. Whitfield's federal service, while appreciated, doesn't negate his responsibility for the deaths of 3 men. 3 men who were also federal agents," Ezekiel pointed out. 3 men who died because your people ordered their execution to protect a larger operation." Blackwood's facade of diplomatic courtesy finally cracked. "Mr. Washington, you are interfering in matters of national security that you do not and cannot understand. The decisions made during wartime operations involve calculations that civilian minds are not equipped to comprehend." "Then explain it to me," Ezekiel challenged. "Explain how justice works when the government can order murders and then hang the people who carry out those orders. Explain how the law means anything when it can be ignored whenever it becomes inconvenient." The question struck at the heart of everything that troubled Ezekiel about this case. If federal authorities could sacrifice individuals to protect larger interests, then concepts like justice and due process became meaningless abstractions. The law became merely another tool of power rather than a principle that constrained power's exercise. "Some prices are worth paying for the greater good," Blackwood replied, his voice carrying the cold certainty of someone who had made similar calculations many times before. "Individual justice sometimes must yield to collective security." "Whose collective?" Ezekiel asked. "Whose security? Because from where I'm standing, it looks like you're protecting yourselves at the expense of everyone else." The exchange had grown heated enough to attract the attention of the federal guards, who moved closer to ensure that the discussion didn't escalate into something more dangerous. Both Ezekiel and Blackwood seemed to recognize that they were approaching the limits of productive dialogue. Judge Pemberton, who had remained silent during the confrontation, finally spoke up. "Assistant Attorney General, if I may suggest a compromise. The execution could be stayed pending a full review of classified materials by appropriate authorities in Washington. That would allow time for a more thorough evaluation without compromising immediate security concerns." Blackwood shook his head, Unacceptable. Delays would only fuel speculation about federal weakness and inconsistency. The execution must proceed as scheduled to maintain public confidence in federal justice. Public confidence in federal justice? Ezekiel repeated incredulously. You think people will have confidence in a system that hangs its own operatives? People will have confidence in a system that delivers promised results, Blackwood replied. They were promised that Marcus Whitfield would hang for murdering 3 freedmen. Anything less than fulfilling that promise would be seen as federal capitulation to Confederate pressure. The cynicism was breathtaking. Blackwood was admitting that the execution would proceed not because Whitfield was guilty as charged, but because the federal government had made public commitments that it felt obligated to honor, regardless of subsequently discovered evidence. Whitfield, who had been listening to this exchange with increasing resignation, finally spoke up. Ezekiel, I want you to know that your effort wasn't wasted. You've shown me that someone still believes in principles worth defending, even when defending them is dangerous. This isn't over, Ezekiel replied, though his voice lacked conviction. There has to be some way to make the truth matter. The truth always matters, Whitfield said quietly. Sometimes it just takes longer to make itself felt than we'd like. Blackwood checked his pocket watch with the impatience of someone accustomed to controlling schedules. The execution will proceed in 1 hour. I suggest we conclude this discussion and allow Mr. Whitfield to make his final preparations. As the federal officials prepared to leave, Ezekiel remained seated against the stone wall, unwilling to accept that his intervention had failed so completely. He had risked everything to bring the truth forward, only to discover that truth was just another commodity to be weighed against political convenience. Mr. Washington, Blackwood said as he reached the cell door, I trust you understand that discussing classified information outside appropriate channels would constitute a federal crime. The materials you've seen today must remain confidential, regardless of how this situation resolves. It was a threat wrapped in bureaucratic language, a reminder that Ezekiel's own freedom could be forfeit if he chose to challenge federal authority too directly. He was being told to return to his cabin and his quiet life, to accept that justice was a luxury that men like him couldn't afford to pursue too vigorously. But as the officials departed and left him alone with Marcus Whitfield, Ezekiel realized that this confrontation was far from over. He had learned something valuable about the nature of power and the lengths to which those in authority would go to protect their interests. That knowledge would inform whatever came next, even if he wasn't yet sure what form his resistance would take. They think this ends with your death, he told Whitfield quietly. They think they can bury the truth along with you. Maybe they can, Whitfield replied, but maybe they're wrong. Maybe truth has a way of surfacing even when powerful people try to keep it buried. Outside, the courthouse clock began striking the hour, its bronze voice carrying across a town that expected to witness justice but would instead see the execution of political necessity disguised as law. The crowd had swollen to nearly 300 souls by the time Assistant Attorney General Blackwood emerged from the courthouse, his expensive boots clicking against the wooden steps with the measured cadence of a man accustomed to being the center of attention. The morning sun had burned away the early mist, leaving the air crisp and sharp with the promise of autumn's final surrender to winter. Every face in the assembled throng turned toward him, their expressions ranging from eager anticipation to barely contained hostility, all united in their expectation that federal justice would finally be served. Sheriff Burke stood beside the gallows platform, his hand resting on the lever that would spring the trap door beneath Marcus Whitfield's feet. The sheriff's face bore the look of a man who had wrestled with his conscience and lost his duty to maintain order, overriding whatever personal reservations he might have harbored about the proceedings. Behind him, 2 federal guards maintained positions that allowed them to observe both the platform and the crowd, their rifles held at ready positions that suggested they expected trouble. Blackwood raised his hand for silence, and the murmur of conversation died away like wind before a storm. When he spoke, his voice carried easily across the square, trained by years of addressing hostile audiences in courtrooms and legislative chambers, where political careers lived and died on the strength of spoken words. "Citizens of Millerville," he began, his tone carrying the formal authority of federal power. "We are gathered here today to witness the execution of justice in the case of Marcus Whitfield, convicted of the murders of George Patterson, Samuel Reeves, and Benjamin Foster." A cheer rose from sections of the crowd, voices raised in celebration of what they saw as long overdue accountability for Confederate violence against freed slaves. But the sound was not universal, and Ezekiel noticed pockets of silence where people stood with folded arms and skeptical expressions, their loyalty to old Confederate sympathies outweighing their satisfaction with federal justice. "Some of you may have heard rumors of last-minute evidence or federal intervention," Blackwood continued, his eyes scanning the crowd with the calculating gaze of a politician reading his audience. "I want to assure you that all relevant materials have been thoroughly reviewed by appropriate authorities. The conviction stands, and the sentence will be carried out as ordered by federal court." The lie was delivered with such polished conviction that even Ezekiel, who knew the truth, found himself momentarily doubting his own memories of the morning's events. Blackwood was a master of his craft, capable of reshaping reality through the sheer force of authoritative presentation. Near the front of the crowd, Ezekiel spotted the group of freedmen he had encountered earlier. Jeremiah Bass stood with his arms crossed, his expression troubled despite his presence at what should have been a moment of triumph. Clara Washington watched the proceedings with the same suspicious intensity she had directed at Ezekiel, as if sensing that something important was being concealed beneath the ceremonies. Official narrative. The courthouse door opened with deliberate solemnity, and Marcus Whitfield emerged flanked by federal guards. The condemned man had been allowed to wash and dress in clean clothes for his final appearance, and he carried himself with the dignity of someone who had made peace with his fate. His hands were bound behind his back, but his shoulders remained straight and his gaze steady as he surveyed the crowd that had gathered to witness his death. Ezekiel felt a complex mixture of emotions as he watched his former master approach the gallows. There was no satisfaction in seeing Whitfield face execution, but neither was there simple sympathy for a man who had participated in murder, regardless of his motives. What dominated Ezekiel's thoughts was a profound sense of injustice, not at Whitfield's fate, but at the system that could manipulate truth so completely in service of political convenience. The chaplain, Reverend Morrison, stepped forward to offer final spiritual comfort to the condemned man. Morrison was a thin, elderly minister whose gentle demeanor had made him a trusted figure among both black and white congregants during the difficult years of Reconstruction. His presence lent an air of legitimate solemnity to proceedings that might otherwise have resembled a lynching dressed up in legal formalities. "Marcus Whitfield," the chaplain said, his voice carrying clearly in the still morning air, "do you have any final words before this sentence is carried out?" Whitfield looked out over the assembled crowd, his eyes moving slowly across faces that represented every faction in the county's complex social hierarchy. Former slaves who saw his execution as symbolic justice, Confederate sympathizers who viewed him as a scapegoat for federal oppression, federal officials who needed his death to maintain political narratives, local authorities caught between competing loyalties and pressures. When his gaze found Ezekiel in the crowd, Whitfield's expression softened almost imperceptibly. For a moment, the two men looked at each other across the physical and social distance that separated them, former master and former slave, both trapped in a historical moment that had twisted their relationship into something neither had anticipated nor desired. "I have lived my life according to what I believed was right," Whitfield said finally, his voice steady despite the circumstances. "I have made choices that cost other men their lives, and I accept responsibility for those choices. But I want those gathered here to understand that truth is more complex than it appears, and justice is more difficult to achieve than we would like to believe." The words were carefully chosen to acknowledge his guilt while hinting at complexities that could not be revealed. It was as close as Whitfield could come to explaining his federal service without violating the security constraints that Blackwood had imposed. Even facing death, he maintained his commitment to protecting secrets that might save other lives. Blackwood's face darkened at what he clearly interpreted as a veiled challenge to the official narrative. The Assistant Attorney General stepped forward, inserting himself into a ceremony that was supposed to proceed according to established protocols. The defendant was given full opportunity to present all relevant evidence at his trial, Blackwood announced, his voice carrying a warning that was directed as much at the crowd as at Whitfield. Federal courts operate according to established law, not according to last-minute claims or unsubstantiated allegations. But Whitfield was not finished. "I want to thank one man in particular," he continued, his eyes returning to Ezekiel, "for trying to ensure that all relevant facts were considered." Ezekiel Washington risked considerable personal danger to bring forward evidence that he believed might affect this case. His courage in speaking truth to power demonstrates the kind of character that this nation will need if we are to heal the wounds that divide us. The statement sent ripples of shock through the crowd. Many of those present knew Ezekiel by sight, if not by name, and the revelation that he had intervened on Whitfield's behalf challenged their assumptions about racial loyalty and historical justice. Former slaves began turning to look at him with expressions ranging from confusion to outright accusation, while white observers watched with the fascination of people witnessing something unprecedented and potentially dangerous. Clara Washington's voice cut through the murmur of crowd reaction like a blade. "Ezekiel Washington, you stand up here and explain yourself. How are you going to help the man who owned you for 27 years? The challenge was delivered with the moral authority of someone who had suffered under the same system of oppression, and it demanded an answer that Ezekiel wasn't sure he could provide in terms that would satisfy his questioners. The crowd's attention had shifted entirely to him, creating a moment of crisis that threatened to overshadow Whitfield's execution entirely. Ezekiel felt the weight of hundreds of eyes upon him as he stepped forward, moving through the crowd that parted reluctantly before him. Each step carried him deeper into a confrontation that would define not only his own future, but his community's understanding of what freedom meant and what obligations it carried. "Clara's right to ask," he said when he reached a position where his voice could carry to the entire assembly. "You all got a right to know why I did what I did." Judge Pemberton had emerged from the courthouse and now stood watching the proceedings with obvious concern. This deviation from established protocol was exactly the kind of public spectacle that federal authorities sought to avoid. But stopping it now would only fuel speculation about what was being concealed. 27 years I was Marcus Whitfield's slave," Ezekiel continued, his voice growing stronger as he found his footing in this unexpected moment of public testimony. 27 years I worked his land, followed his orders, watched him sell my children when he needed money for his gambling debts. So nobody can say I speak from love or loyalty or any debt I think I owe him." The crowd was listening now with the intense attention that people reserve for moments when fundamental truths are being revealed. Even Blackwood seemed uncertain about whether to intervene, calculating the political costs of stopping a freedman from speaking his mind in public. "But I speak from something else," Ezekiel went on. "I speak from the belief that law has to mean something if freedom is going to mean anything. I speak from the conviction that truth matters more than convenience, even when that truth is complicated and uncomfortable." "What truth?" called out someone from the back of the crowd. "What are you talking about?" Ezekiel glanced at Blackwood, whose face had gone pale with the realization that federal security concerns were about to collide with a freedman's determination to speak his conscience in public. The Assistant Attorney General was caught between his need to maintain secrecy and his inability to silence a former slave without appearing to suppress inconvenient testimony. The truth that this man was not what the prosecution claimed he was, Ezekiel replied carefully. The truth that his actions, however wrong they might have been, were more complicated than the simple story of Confederate hatred that put him on that gallows. Sheriff Burke stepped forward, his hand moving to his sidearm in a gesture that was probably unconscious, but nonetheless threatening. "You're talking about classified federal matters," he warned. "Things that could endanger ongoing operations." The admission sent another shock through the crowd. Burke had just confirmed that there were indeed federal secrets connected to Whitfield's case, giving credibility to Ezekiel's claims while simultaneously revealing the existence of clandestine operations that most citizens had never suspected. Jeremiah Bass pushed forward through the crowd, his carpenter's instincts recognizing the structural weaknesses in the official narrative. "What kind of classified matters?" he demanded. "What operations? If this man is dying for federal business, we got a right to know about it." "You have a right to witness justice being served according to law," Blackwood replied, his diplomatic training finally reasserting itself. "You do not have a right to compromise ongoing security operations that protect this entire region." But the crowd was no longer willing to accept bureaucratic evasions. The revelation that Whitfield's case involved federal secrets had transformed what should have been a simple execution into something far more complex and troubling. Voices were raised demanding explanations, and the careful choreography of federal justice began to unravel under the pressure of public scrutiny. Dr. Carruthers, who had been observing from the edge of the crowd, stepped forward with the authority that his profession and age had earned him. "Assistant Attorney General," he said formally, "if there are facts relevant to this man's conviction that have not been made public, then proceeding with his execution would be a mockery of the justice you claim to represent." The doctor's intervention carried particular weight because of his reputation for political neutrality and professional integrity. Unlike many of those present, Carruthers had no obvious axe to grind in racial or sexual conflicts, making his challenge to federal authority more difficult to dismiss as partisan troublemaking. "Dr. Carruthers," Blackwood replied, "there are always operational details in complex cases that cannot be revealed for security reasons. That does not invalidate properly obtained convictions or properly imposed sentences. But it does raise questions about whether justice is being served or merely performed," the doctor countered. "And those questions deserve answers before an irreversible action is taken." The philosophical debate was interrupted by a commotion near the gallows platform. Marcus Whitfield, who had been standing silently throughout this exchange, had stepped forward to the edge of the platform where his voice could carry clearly across the entire square. "Enough," he said, his tone carrying the authority that had once commanded a plantation and now commanded attention through moral force alone. "I will not allow my death to be the occasion for others to face persecution or danger." He turned to address Ezekiel directly, his voice carrying a warmth that surprised those who remembered him only as a stern master. "Ezekiel Washington, you have honored the principles that make freedom meaningful. You have shown courage that I was unable to show when it mattered most. Whatever happens here today, know that your actions have been worthy of the liberty you have earned." The words were delivered with the solemnity of a final blessing, and they carried an emotional weight that seemed to settle over the crowd like a shroud. Even those who had come expecting to celebrate Whitfield's death found themselves moved by the dignity with which he faced his fate, and the grace with which he acknowledged Ezekiel's intervention. "But I want everyone here to understand something," Whitfield continued, his voice growing stronger as he approached his final statement. "The man who brought forward evidence in my case did so not out of personal loyalty, but out of commitment to principles that transcend individual relationships. He believed that truth should be heard, even when it complicates simple narratives of guilt and innocence. Blackwood realized that Whitfield was maneuvering toward revelations that could not be allowed, and he signaled to Sheriff Burke to proceed with the execution. But the sheriff hesitated, clearly reluctant to cut short what appeared to be a dying man's final words to his community. The evidence that Mr. Washington brought forward, Whitfield pressed on, speaking more quickly now as he sensed his time running out, reveals that my actions were taken under federal authority, in service of operations designed to protect both black and white citizens from organized violence. Enough! Blackwood shouted, abandoning all pretense of dignified federal authority. Sheriff Burke, carry out the sentence immediately. But Whitfield's words had already accomplished their purpose. The crowd now understood that he had been working for the federal government, that his conviction was based on incomplete information, and that his execution was proceeding despite evidence that might have changed the verdict. The simple narrative of Confederate terrorism being punished by federal justice had been revealed as a complex web of competing loyalties and conflicting objectives. Ezekiel watched as Sheriff Burke approached the gallows lever with obvious reluctance. The entire ceremony had devolved into something that satisfied no one. Not the freedmen who had hoped to see justice for murdered informants, not the Confederate sympathizers who viewed Whitfield as a scapegoat, and certainly not the federal authorities who had wanted to demonstrate decisive action against racial violence. The rope swayed gently in the morning breeze, waiting to receive the neck of a man whose true crime was not murder, but the misfortune of serving masters whose priorities had shifted with political convenience. In the crowd below, former slaves and former slaveholders stood side by side, united for perhaps the first time in their shared recognition that the justice being served bore little resemblance to the principles it claimed to represent. As sheriff Burke's hand closed around the lever that would end Marcus Whitfield's life, Ezekiel understood that this moment would haunt all of them, not because a guilty man was dying, but because they were all complicit in a system that could sacrifice truth to expediency and call the result justice. The gallows cast its shadow across the courthouse square like a sundial marking, not the passage of time, but the distance between what was legal and what was right. Time seemed suspended in amber as Sheriff Burke's hand trembled on the gallows lever, the weight of 300 expectant souls pressing down upon him like a physical force. The morning sun had climbed higher, casting sharp shadows that divided the courthouse square into islands of light and darkness, each citizen standing in one realm or the other as if the very ground beneath their feet reflected the moral complexity of what they were witnessing. Marcus Whitfield stood upon the trapdoor with the noose around his neck, but his eyes were fixed not on the crowd below nor on the horizon beyond, but on Ezekiel Washington, who had emerged from the mass of onlookers to stand at the base of the gallows platform. The distance between them was perhaps 10 feet, but it spanned decades of shared history, centuries of racial division, and the immeasurable gulf between oppressor and oppressed that had defined their relationship from its beginning. Assistant Attorney General Blackwood's face had taken on the mottled flush of a man whose carefully constructed plans were disintegrating before his eyes. The federal authority he represented had been built on the premise that information could be controlled, that narratives could be managed, and that public opinion could be shaped through the strategic release of selected facts. But Ezekiel's intervention had shattered that premise, exposing the gap between official truth and actual truth in ways that could not be easily contained or explained away. "Sheriff Burke," Blackwood commanded, his voice carrying the brittle edge of desperation, disguised as authority, "I order you to proceed with the execution immediately. Any further delay undermines federal law and encourages resistance to legitimate authority." But Burke's hand remained frozen on the lever, paralyzed by the collision of competing obligations. As an elected local official, he answered to the community. that had witnessed the morning's revelations about federal deception. As a sworn officer of the court, he was bound to carry out legally imposed sentences regardless of personal reservations. The two roles had become irreconcilable, leaving him trapped in a moment of decision that would define not only his own character, but the relationship between federal and local authority in the post-war South. Dr. Carruthers stepped closer to the platform, his medical bag clutched in one hand like a talisman of healing in a place devoted to death. "Sheriff," he said quietly, his voice carrying the weight of professional authority earned through decades of service to the community, "there are procedures for addressing new evidence in capital cases." "Perhaps we should." "There is no new evidence," Blackwood snapped, cutting off the doctor's suggestion with the vehemence of someone fighting to maintain control over a situation that had already slipped beyond his grasp. "There are only classified materials that have been improperly disclosed by individuals who lack the authority or clearance to understand their true significance." The exchange revealed the fundamental dishonesty at the heart of the federal position. Blackwood was simultaneously denying the existence of new evidence while acknowledging that classified materials had indeed been disclosed. The contradiction was transparent to everyone present, further eroding whatever credibility federal authorities might have retained. Ezekiel felt the moment crystallizing around him like ice forming on still water. Everything that had led to this point, his decision to come forward, his confrontation with federal authority, his willingness to challenge the simple narrative of justice that his own community preferred, had been building toward this instant, when truth and power would collide in the most public forum possible. "Mr. Blackwood," he said, his voice cutting through the tension with surprising clarity, "you keep talking about classified materials and federal authority, but you haven't answered the most important question of all." The Assistant Attorney General turned toward him with undisguised hostility. "And what question is that, Mr. Washington?" "Whether you believe that justice means anything more than political convenience," Ezekiel replied. "Whether the federal government stands for principles or just for power dressed up in legal language." The challenge hung in the morning air like smoke from a discharged pistol. Ezekiel had essentially accused the highest-ranking federal official present of subordinating justice to expediency, a charge that could not be ignored without appearing to concede its validity. "The federal government stands for the rule of law," Blackwood replied, his diplomatic training reasserting itself in the face of public scrutiny. "We stand for the principle that legally obtained convictions should not be overturned by last-minute revelations of classified information that cannot be properly verified or evaluated." "But what if that classified information proves the man is innocent?" pressed Dr. Carruthers, who had positioned himself where his voice could carry to the entire crowd. "What if it shows that he was acting under federal orders when he committed the acts that condemned him?" "Innocence and guilt are legal determinations made by properly constituted courts, based on admissible evidence," Blackwood responded, falling back on procedural technicalities in the absence of moral arguments he could defend. "They are not determined by public opinion or inflammatory speeches delivered at the site of execution." Clara Washington's voice rose from the crowd with the moral authority of someone who had suffered under the system being discussed. "You are talking about legal determinations and admissible evidence, but what about right and wrong? What about a man dying for crimes he committed because your people ordered him to commit them?" Her intervention shifted the debate from abstract legal principles to concrete moral questions that everyone present could understand. Clara had distilled the complexity of federal intelligence operations and classified evidence into a simple proposition. Was it right to execute a man for following orders, even illegal orders, issued by the same government that now sought his death? Marcus Whitfield, who had been listening to this exchange with growing amazement, finally spoke from his position on the gallows platform. "I need to say something before this goes any further," he announced, his voice carrying clearly across the square. Something that Assistant Attorney General Blackwood cannot prevent me from saying because I am beyond the reach of federal prosecution. Blackwood's face went pale as he realized that a dying man's final words could not be suppressed without creating a spectacle that would be remembered long after the execution itself was forgotten. Whatever constraints had kept Whitfield silent during his trial were meaningless now that he stood with a noose around his neck. The three men whose deaths condemned me, George Patterson, Samuel Reeves, and Benjamin Foster, were indeed federal informants, Whitfield said, his voice growing stronger as he approached the revelation that had been denied throughout his trial. They were killed because their cover had been compromised, and I was ordered to participate in their execution to maintain my own position as a federal operative. A gasp ran through the crowd as the truth that many had suspected was finally confirmed by the condemned man himself. The simple narrative of Confederate revenge against innocent freedmen had been revealed as a complex tale of competing loyalties and tragic choices, made in service of larger strategic objectives. Colonel Morrison gave me those orders personally. Whitfield continued, his eyes finding Ezekiel in the crowd below. He told me that 3 lives were an acceptable price to pay for maintaining access to intelligence that could prevent much larger massacres. I disagreed with that calculation, but I followed orders because I believed that federal authority represented the best hope for peace in this region. Blackwood was frantically signaling to Sheriff Burke to proceed with the execution, but the sheriff seemed transfixed by Whitfield's confession. Here was information that completely recontextualized the case, revealing the condemned man not as a Confederate terrorist but as a federal agent, whose service had cost him everything including his life. "Why didn't you tell the court this during your trial?" called out Jeremiah Bass, his carpenter's practical mind seeking to understand the logic behind Whitfield's silence. "Because revealing my federal service would have compromised other operatives still in the field," Whitfield replied. "Because I believed that protecting ongoing operations was more important than saving my own life. Because I trusted that federal authorities would eventually acknowledge my service and commute my sentence." The last statement carried a note of bitter irony that was not lost on anyone present. Whitfield had remained silent to protect federal interests, only to discover that those same federal interests required his death to maintain political narratives that had proven more important than individual justice. "But now you're talking," observed Clara Washington. "Now you're telling us everything. What changed?" Whitfield's eyes returned to Ezekiel, and his expression softened with something that might have been gratitude or recognition, or simply the peace that comes from finally speaking truth after months of enforced silence. "What changed," he said quietly, "is that I realize there are principles more important than following orders, even orders given by people you trust and respect. What changed is that I saw someone risk everything to ensure that the truth was heard, even when that truth was inconvenient and dangerous." The reference to Ezekiel's intervention was unmistakable, and it sent a ripple of understanding through the crowd. Here was a white man, moments from death, publicly acknowledging that a former slave had shown more courage and moral clarity than the federal authorities who claimed to represent justice and the rule of law. Assistant Attorney General Blackwood could no longer contain his frustration with proceedings that had deviated so completely from their intended script. "Sheriff Burke," he commanded, "I order you to carry out this execution immediately or face charges of obstruction of federal justice." The threat was real, and everyone present knew it. Burke could be removed from office, prosecuted, and imprisoned if he refused to follow direct orders from federal authority. But the sheriff had spent his entire career navigating the treacherous waters between local sentiment and outside pressure, and he possessed the political instincts necessary to recognize when the ground was shifting beneath his feet. "Assistant Attorney General," Burke replied slowly, "I took an oath to uphold the law and serve justice." If this man was acting under federal orders when he committed the acts that condemned him, then proceeding with his execution would make me complicit in a miscarriage of justice. The law is what federal courts determine it to be, Blackwood shot back. Your obligations are to carry out legally imposed sentences, not to second-guess decisions made by your superiors. But superior to what? Ezekiel interjected, stepping closer to the gallows platform. Superior to conscience? Superior to the truth? Superior to the principles that supposedly justify federal authority in the first place? The question struck at the heart of Reconstruction politics, challenging the moral foundation upon which federal intervention in Southern affairs was based. If federal authority was justified by commitment to justice and equality, then using that authority to suppress inconvenient truths undermined its own legitimacy. Dr. Carruthers moved to support Ezekiel's position, lending his professional credibility to what was becoming a community-wide challenge to federal duplicity. Assistant Attorney General, he said formally, you have heard testimony from the condemned man himself that fundamentally alters our understanding of his crimes. Proceeding with his execution under these circumstances would be judicial murder disguised as a legal process. The accusation was harsh but accurate, and it resonated with crowd members who had been wavering between support for federal authority and suspicion of government motives. Even those who had initially supported Whitfield's execution were beginning to question whether they were witnessing justice or merely the cynical manipulation of legal procedures to achieve predetermined political objectives. Whitfield, sensing that the momentum had shifted in ways that might actually save his life, made one final effort to ensure that his survival would serve larger purposes than personal preservation. If I am spared, he announced, I commit to revealing everything I know about federal intelligence operations in this region, regardless of classification levels or security concerns. The people of this county deserve to know the full truth about what has been done in their name and with their tax money. The offer was simultaneously generous and threatening. It promised transparency that could serve public interest, while warning that survival would come at the cost of exposing secrets that federal authorities desperately wanted to keep hidden. Blackwood realized that allowing Whitfield to live might create even larger problems than executing him, but proceeding with the hanging would now clearly appear to be an effort to silence inconvenient testimony rather than serve justice. Sheriff Burke's hand slowly released the gallows lever as he made the most important decision of his career. I cannot in good conscience proceed with this execution, he announced, his voice carrying across the square with surprising firmness. New evidence has come to light that calls into question the defendant's guilt as originally determined. Federal authorities can remove me from office if they choose, but they cannot force me to participate in what appears to be judicial murder. The crowd erupted in a mixture of cheers and protests, with different factions responding according to their own political loyalties and moral convictions. Some saw Burke's decision as a courageous stand for justice, while others viewed it as capitulation to federal pressure or misguided sympathy for a convicted killer. But the execution had been stopped, at least temporarily, and that created space for further consideration of evidence that had been suppressed. Throughout the legal proceedings, Ezekiel felt a complex mixture of relief and apprehension as he watched. Federal guards removed the noose from Whitfield's neck and escort him back toward the courthouse. The immediate crisis had passed, but larger questions remained about what would happen next and whether temporary reprieve would translate into genuine justice. As the crowd began to disperse, many people approached Ezekiel with expressions ranging from gratitude to suspicion to simple curiosity about his motives and methods. Clara Washington was among the first to reach him, her weathered face bearing a look of grudging respect mixed with continued wariness. You did something today that took more courage than most folks will ever need, she said quietly. But you also opened doors that might be hard to close again. Federal government don't forgive easy, and they got long memories for people who crossed them. Her warning was well-founded, and Ezekiel knew it. His intervention had succeeded in stopping Whitfield's execution, but it had also marked him as someone willing to challenge federal authority when it conflicted with his understanding of justice. That reputation could prove dangerous in a region where federal power was absolute and dissent was often treated as treason. Dr. Carruthers approached with his medical bag and the professional demeanor that had made him a trusted figure throughout the community's various crises. "Mr. Washington," he said formally, "what you did today honored the best traditions of American jurisprudence. You insisted that evidence be heard and that truth be told, regardless of the personal cost. That takes the kind of moral courage that this nation will need if we are to heal the wounds that divide us." The doctor's praise was gratifying, but Ezekiel remained focused on practical questions about what would happen next. Blackwood had not departed with the dispersing crowd, but remained near the courthouse steps, engaged in intense conversation with federal guards and local officials. Whatever decisions were being made would likely determine not only Whitfield's ultimate fate, but the consequences that Ezekiel himself would face for his intervention. Judge Pemberton emerged from the courthouse and approached the small group that had gathered around Ezekiel. The federal judge's expression was grave but not hostile, suggesting that he viewed the morning's events as a legal crisis, requiring careful management rather than a personal affront to his authority. "Mr. Washington," Pemberton said quietly, "your actions today have created a situation that will require considerable legal and political maneuvering to resolve. Assistant Attorney General Blackwood is already discussing options for proceeding with federal prosecution, despite the complications you have introduced." "What kind of options?" Ezekiel asked, though he suspected the answer would not be encouraging. "Charges against you for unauthorized disclosure of classified information," Pemberton replied. "Possible transfer of Mr. Whitfield to a federal facility where security can be maintained more effectively. A complete review of intelligence operations in this region to determine what can be salvaged from this debacle." The judge's analysis was clinically accurate but politically naive. He was describing legal and administrative responses to a crisis that had fundamentally challenged the moral authority of the federal government in the region. No amount of legal maneuvering could restore credibility that had been lost through the exposure of systematic deception and the attempt to execute a man for following federal orders. Jeremy Bass, who had been listening to this conversation with growing concern, stepped forward to offer his own perspective on the situation. "Judge," he said respectfully, "seems to me that the federal government's got bigger problems than Mr. Washington's unauthorized disclosures. Seems like the real problem is that y'all have been running secret operations and then hanging the people who carry them out when it becomes politically convenient." The carpenter's analysis cut through legal technicalities to identify the core issue that would determine public reaction to the day's events. Federal credibility had been damaged not by Ezekiel's revelations, but by the policies and practices that his revelations had exposed. Prosecuting him for disclosure would only reinforce public perception that federal authorities cared more about protecting their secrets than serving justice. As the immediate participants in the morning's drama continued their discussion, Marcus Whitfield was led back into the courthouse under heavy guard. His execution had been postponed rather than canceled, leaving his ultimate fate dependent on political calculations that had already proven unreliable. But he was alive, and that represented a victory for the principle that evidence should be heard, even when it complicates preferred narratives. Ezekiel understood that his own ordeal was just beginning. Federal authorities would not simply forgive. His challenge to their authority and local reactions to his intervention remained mixed at best. Some would see him as a hero who had stood up for justice, while others would view him as a traitor who had sided with a white Confederate against the interests of his own people. But as he walked away from the courthouse square, accompanied by The small group of citizens who had witnessed his moment of moral courage, Ezekiel felt a sense of peace that had eluded him throughout the long night of decision-making that had preceded this day. He had chosen to speak truth regardless of consequences, to defend principles rather than expedience, and to insist that justice means something more than political convenience. The whispered words that Marcus Whitfield had spoken before being led away echoed in Ezekiel's memory. Thank you for showing me that freedom means having the courage to do what's right, even when it's dangerous. Thank you for proving that some things are worth the risk. Those words, delivered by a former master to his former slave, represented a transformation that transcended individual relationships to touch the deeper questions of what America could become if it chose to honor its founding principles rather than merely invoke them when convenient. The rope had not claimed Marcus Whitfield's life, but it had revealed truths about power, justice, and moral courage that would outlive both men and influence the ongoing struggle to create a society worthy of its highest aspirations. The afternoon brought unexpected visitors to Ezekiel's cabin, each arrival marking another chapter in the unfolding consequences of his morning intervention. The first was Martha Hendricks, the elderly housekeeper whose preservation of Colonel Morrison's correspondence had made the day's revelations possible. She arrived on foot, despite her advanced age, carrying a small bundle wrapped in brown paper that she pressed into Ezekiel's hands without ceremony. "More papers," she said simply, her weathered face bearing the satisfied expression of someone who had been vindicated by events. "Things Colonel Morrison left behind that might be useful if the federal folks try to cause you trouble. Names, dates, operational details that show how deep this intelligence network really goes." Ezekiel unwrapped the bundle carefully, revealing documents that could expose federal operations throughout central Georgia. The papers detailed payments to informants, strategic objectives for Reconstruction intelligence gathering, and correspondence between field operatives and their superiors in Atlanta and Washington. It was a treasure trove of information that could either protect him from federal prosecution or make him an even more dangerous target for elimination. "Why are you giving me these?" he asked, though he suspected he already knew the answer. "Because you proved today that you understand the difference between serving power and serving justice," Martha replied. "Because these papers are safer in your hands than buried in my root cellar. And because if something happens to me, somebody needs to know the full truth about what's been going on in this county." Her words carried the weight of mortality and the urgency of someone who had lived long enough to recognize history in the making. Martha had survived slavery, war, and the early years of Reconstruction by being careful and invisible, but Ezekiel's courage had inspired her to take risks she would never have contemplated before witnessing his confrontation with federal authority. The second visitor was Timothy Fletcher, the sawmill owner's son whose warning had alerted Ezekiel to the initial threats against his safety. Timothy arrived on horseback, his face flushed with excitement and concern in equal measure. Word spreading fast about what happened at the courthouse, Timothy reported, dismounting and tying his horse to Ezekiel's fence post. "Some folks are calling you a hero for standing up to federal lies. Others are saying you betrayed your own people by helping a Confederate murderer escape justice." The divided reaction was exactly what Ezekiel had expected, but hearing it confirmed by someone with connections throughout the white community added weight to his growing concerns about future safety. Public opinion in the post-war South was volatile and unpredictable, capable of shifting rapidly from admiration to hostility based on political winds that ordinary citizens could neither control nor fully understand. "What's your father saying?" Ezekiel asked, knowing that the elder Fletcher's opinions would influence employment opportunities throughout the region. "He's worried about federal retaliation against anyone who supported your actions," Timothy admitted. "Says the government might decide to make examples of locals who interfered with their operations. But he also respects what you did, even if he can't say so publicly." The qualified support was typical of white moderate opinion during Reconstruction, genuine appreciation for principled action, coupled with practical concerns about the consequences of challenging federal authority. Men like the elder Fletcher had learned to navigate between competing pressures by avoiding public commitments that might prove costly if political circumstances changed. "There's something else," Timothy continued, glancing around to ensure they weren't being observed. "Federal agents have been asking questions about you around town, wanting to know about your reading and writing skills, your connections with other freedmen, whether you've been involved in any political activities." The surveillance was beginning sooner than Ezekiel had anticipated, suggesting that federal authorities viewed him as a significant threat rather than merely a troublesome individual who had stumbled onto classified information. His intervention had marked him as someone capable of organized resistance to federal policies, making him a priority target for investigation and possible prosecution. As Timothy departed with promises to keep Ezekiel informed about federal activities, a third visitor appeared on the path leading to the cabin. This was Isaiah Walker, the former slave from South Carolina who had taught Ezekiel to read during their time in the contraband camp outside Atlanta. Isaiah's presence was both welcome and ominous welcome, because he was a trusted friend and advisor. Ominous because his journey from South Carolina suggested that news of the morning's events had already spread beyond local boundaries. "Heard you stirred up a hornet's nest," Isaiah said by way of greeting, his weathered hands clasping Ezekiel's in the firm grip of shared experience and mutual respect. "Heard you made some powerful enemies and maybe saved a man's life in the process." "News travels fast," Ezekiel observed, leading his friend toward the cabin's porch where they could talk privately. "Faster than you might think," Isaiah replied gravely. "Federal telegraph lines have been busy all day, and some of those messages concerned a certain freedman in Millerville who's been causing problems for government operations." The revelation that federal authorities were already coordinating responses to his intervention confirmed Ezekiel's worst fears about the consequences of challenging government secrecy. His actions had attracted attention at the highest levels of federal authority, making him a person of interest in investigations that could destroy his life and endanger anyone associated with him. "What kind of problems?" Ezekiel asked, though he dreaded the answer. "The kind that suggest you might want to consider leaving Georgia for a while," Isaiah replied bluntly. "I got friends in Pennsylvania, Ohio, places where a man with your skills could find work and federal attention might be less intense." The suggestion of flight was practical but galling. Ezekiel had fought too hard for his small plot of land and his position in the community to abandon everything because federal authorities found his principles inconvenient. Running would feel like validation of their power to silence dissent through intimidation, even if staying meant risking imprisonment or worse. "Can't run from what's right," Ezekiel said finally. "If they want to prosecute me for telling the truth, then let them try to explain that to a jury of citizens who saw what happened today." Isaiah's expression grew even more serious. "Brother, you think they're gonna let this get to a jury? You think they're gonna risk more public exposure of their secret operations? They got ways of dealing with problems that don't involve courtrooms or due process." The warning was stark and accurate. Federal authorities operating in the post-war South had access to methods of enforcement that bypassed normal legal protections, particularly when dealing with individuals they viewed as threats to national security. Ezekiel's knowledge of classified operations made him a candidate for extra-legal solutions that would be easier to implement than public prosecution. As evening approached, a fourth visitor materialized from the gathering dusk: Dr. Carruthers, whose medical bag and professional demeanor had provided moral authority to the morning's challenge of federal duplicity. The doctor's presence at Ezekiel's cabin was both surprising and significant, suggesting that respectable white citizens were willing to associate themselves publicly with his cause, despite Potential risks to their own standing, Mr. Washington. Dr. Carruthers said formally, removing his hat as he approached the porch where Ezekiel and Isaiah were continuing their conversation. I wanted to express my personal gratitude for your courage today, and to discuss some practical matters regarding your future safety. The doctor's concerns paralleled those expressed by previous visitors, but his professional standing and connections throughout the community gave his warnings particular weight. If Dr. Carruthers was worried about federal retaliation, then the danger was real and immediate. Several prominent citizens have been discussing your situation, the doctor continued. We believe that federal authorities may attempt to discredit or silence you through various means: legal prosecution, economic pressure, or more direct forms of intimidation. What kind of economic pressure? Ezekiel asked, recognizing that his livelihood at the sawmill could easily be threatened by federal interference. Pressure on employers to terminate your services, difficulty obtaining credit or supplies, interference with land ownership rights, Dr. Carruthers explained. The federal government has many ways of making life difficult for individuals they view as problematic, particularly when those individuals lack powerful allies or legal resources. The systematic nature of potential retaliation revealed the extent to which federal authority had expanded beyond traditional constitutional limits during Reconstruction. Agencies that had been created to enforce civil rights and maintain order had acquired powers that could be used to suppress dissent and punish those who challenged official narratives. However, the doctor continued, a group of us have decided to establish a legal defense fund and provide other forms of support should federal authorities proceed with prosecution or harassment. Your actions today serve the cause of justice, and justice requires that those who serve it receive protection in return. The offer of community support was unexpected and deeply meaningful. Ezekiel had assumed that his intervention would isolate him from both black and white residents who preferred simple narratives to complex truths. Instead, he was discovering that moral courage could inspire others to take risks they might not have contemplated in ordinary circumstances. As Dr. Carruthers departed with promises to coordinate protective measures, Ezekiel found himself alone with Isaiah and the weight of decisions that would shape the remainder of his life. The documents Martha Hendricks had provided offered potential leverage against federal prosecution, but using them would escalate the conflict beyond personal stakes to include the exposure of intelligence networks throughout the region. You got choices to make, Isaiah observed, studying his friend's face in the lamplight that flickered through the cabin's windows. You can try to disappear, hope they lose interest if you keep quiet and stay out of trouble. You can fight them directly, use those papers to expose more of their operations, and dare them to prosecute you publicly. Or you can find some middle ground, some way to protect yourself without declaring war on the federal government. Each option carried significant risks and uncertain benefits. Disappearing would preserve his physical safety, but abandon the principles that had motivated his intervention. Fighting directly would serve those principles, but could result in imprisonment, exile, or death. Finding middle ground would require political skills and connections that he wasn't sure he possessed. What would you do? Ezekiel asked, valuing his friend's perspective based on years of navigating similar dangers in South Carolina. I'd remember that this ain't just about you anymore, Isaiah replied thoughtfully. What you did today changed things for everybody black. Folks who thought the federal government was always on their side. White folks who thought federal authority was always honest. Poor folks who thought justice was only for rich people. The broader implications of his actions were becoming clearer. As the day progressed, Ezekiel's intervention had revealed systemic problems with federal Reconstruction policies that extended far beyond individual cases of injustice. His exposure of government deception and moral compromise had opened questions about the legitimacy of federal authority that could not be easily closed through prosecution or intimidation. People are gonna be watching what happens to you, Isaiah continued. Gonna be learning lessons about whether courage gets rewarded or punished, whether truth matters or just causes trouble. What you do next is gonna teach those lessons, whether you intend to or not. The responsibility was enormous and somewhat paralyzing. Ezekiel had acted according to his conscience without fully considering how his choices would affect others who faced similar moral dilemmas. Now he found himself in the position of setting precedents that would influence how other citizens responded to government misconduct and official secrecy. The night brought one final visitor, Marcus Whitfield himself, accompanied by a single federal guard whose presence suggested that the former plantation owner remained in official custody despite the postponement of his execution. Whitfield's appearance at Ezekiel's cabin was unprecedented, violating every social convention that had governed their relationship during slavery and marking a transformation that neither man could have imagined just hours earlier. "I asked permission to speak with you privately," Whitfield said, his voice carrying a humility that would have been unthinkable during their master-slave relationship. "There are things I need to say that couldn't be said in front of the crowd." This morning, the federal guard withdrew to a respectful distance, close enough to maintain security, but far enough to allow private conversation. His presence was a reminder that both men remained under federal scrutiny, their words and actions subject to official monitoring and potential legal consequences. "Mr. Marcus," Ezekiel began, unsure how to address a man who had once owned him, but now stood as a fellow victim of federal duplicity. "Just Marcus," Whitfield corrected gently. "We're beyond the old formalities now, I think. What you did today erased a lot of debts and changed a lot of relationships." They sat together on the cabin's porch steps, two men whose lives had been intertwined by slavery and separated by emancipation, now brought together by a shared commitment to truth that transcended their complicated history. The conversation that followed would be remembered by both as one of the most important of their lives. "I need you to understand something," Whitfield said quietly, his words chosen carefully for their accuracy rather than their comfort. "When I owned you, I was a smaller man than I thought I was. I told myself that slavery was natural, that I was fulfilling God's plan, that I was taking care of people who couldn't take care of themselves. I believed those lies because they made my power feel justified." The admission was unprecedented. Former slave owner acknowledging the moral bankruptcy of the system he had participated in and profited from. Ezekiel listened without interruption, recognizing that these words were being spoken for Whitfield's sake as much as his own. "But you've shown me something today that I couldn't see during all those years of owning other human beings," Whitfield continued. "You've shown me what real freedom looks like, not the freedom to own others, but the freedom to choose what's right, even when it's dangerous." The reversal was complete and profound. The man who had once claimed ownership of Ezekiel's body and labor was now acknowledging that his former slave possessed something he had never understood: the moral courage that comes from choosing principles over safety, truth over convenience, justice over expediency. "What you whispered to me this morning," Ezekiel said, recalling the words that had given the day's events their emotional weight. "What did you mean about proving that some things are worth the risk?" Whitfield was quiet for a long moment, gathering thoughts that had been forming throughout the day's extraordinary events. When he spoke, his voice carried the weight of a man who had discovered truths about himself and his society that changed everything he thought he knew. "I meant that you risked everything, your safety, your reputation, your place in the community, to ensure that truth was heard. You could have stayed home, kept quiet, let me hang for crimes that were more complicated than anyone understood. But you chose to stand up for something larger than yourself, or even larger than me." He paused, looking out at the darkening landscape where fireflies were beginning their nightly dance among the trees that had witnessed decades of human struggle and transformation. "You showed me that freedom isn't about having power over others," he continued. It's about having the courage to do what's right when everyone else is choosing what's safe. That's something I never learned in all my years as a master, but something you understood perfectly in your first year as a free man. Words hung between them like a bridge spanning the chasm that history and law and custom had carved between their lives. In acknowledging Ezekiel's moral superiority, Whitfield was completing a transformation that had begun with his decision to serve as a federal informant and culminated in his recognition that true authority comes from character rather than position. As the conversation drew to a close and Whitfield prepared to return to federal custody, both men understood that they had participated in something larger than personal reconciliation. They had demonstrated that relationships defined by oppression could be transformed by mutual recognition of shared humanity and common commitment to justice. The final words they exchanged would be remembered long after the legal and political consequences of the day's events had been resolved. In those words lay the real victory that had been achieved, not the saving of one man's life, but the proof that courage and conscience could triumph over power and expediency when ordinary people chose to act according to their highest understanding of what was right. As the sun reached its zenith above Millerville, casting equal light on all who walked beneath it, regardless of the color of their skin or the content of their past, the gallows stood empty, but not victorious. Truth had proven stronger than the machinery of execution, and courage had triumphed over the forces that sought to sacrifice justice to political necessity. The heart's whisper had been heard above the roar of the crowd, and in that whisper lay the seeds of a future where law might truly serve justice, rather than merely wearing its disguise. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hits the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.